Good evening, you're watching London Live News at 6 with James Dickman. Coming up tonight, ride-hailing app Uber held secret meetings with Tory ministers to try and stop a review that would have had their numbers limited across the capital. Foreign Secretary Liz Truss throws her name into the hat to be the next Prime Minister, as Boris Johnson says he refuses to endorse any candidate. Well, London is sweltering, temperatures back into the 30s with a heat wave warning in place to protect the vulnerable. We'll let you know about how the next few days are panning out. And the Lionesses take on their second match against Norway tonight in the Women's Euros. We'll hear about how this tournament is breaking new records for the women's game. And writer and comedian Andy Hamilton on his new stage show, arriving for a show at the Churchill Theatre in South London. All of that on the way, but first, Uber secretly lobbied ministers to influence London's transport policy, it's been reported today. Leaked documents show lobbyists for the ride-sharing app company met then-Chancellor George Osborne and other ministers, according to the BBC. The undeclared meetings took place after Johnson, as Mayor of London, had promised to launch a review that could have limited Uber's expansion in the capital. Well, the meeting with Mr. Osborne took place at a private dinner in the US state of California, where Uber is based. The politicians, which also includes Sajid Javid, say that lobbying rules were followed and that all business meetings were declared. Boris Johnson has said he will not endorse any candidate in the leadership race to become the next Conservative Party leader. He is determined to deliver the mandate, however, he says. He was elected on in 2019 in his final few weeks as Prime Minister. Here's what he said today.
I'm doing the last few days, weeks, or however long it is, but the job of government has got to be carried on in that period. I've set out for people what the Tory, the parliamentary party have decided. That has the inevitable consequences that it has. But my job, just in the next few days and weeks, is to continue with the programme on which we were elected.
Well, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is the latest big name to enter the leadership race, pledging to start cutting taxes from day one. Bob Blackman, Joint Executive Secretary of the Tories' 1922 committee, says it's likely candidates will need the support of 36 MPs to progress from the first round. So far, 11 candidates are in the running, which sees other big names such as Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, Grant Shapps, Nadeem Zahawi all stepping up. The unifying One Nation Tory backbencher Tom Tugendhat looks to be a dark horse in the runoff, though former Chancellor Rishi Sunak remains the bookie's favourite. Priti Patel is also weighing up a bid, so we could enter this race with 12 candidates. Well, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said candidates are engaged in an arms race of fantasy economics.
Well, what we've seen this weekend from all the Tory candidates who want to be leader of their party is £200 billion of unfunded spending commitments. And my challenge to them is say precisely where that money is coming from. Is it going to be cuts? If so, what's going to be cut? Because we need to know. Is it going to be borrowing? If so, where are you borrowing from? How much are you borrowing? Or is it just the magic money tree? The contrast between the circus at the top of the Tory party and the Labour Party couldn't be greater. We've set out costed funding commitments and explained exactly where the money is coming from. They've just spent more than the budget of the NHS in one weekend without saying where the money is coming from.
Well, they've all been invited to take part in 2 TV debates this Sunday and the 18th of July on Monday. So we'll see what happens there. Now, a few other stories in the capital for you this evening. Barristers have walked out for a third week running in a dispute over pay and working conditions, with many protesting outside the Supreme Court in the capital this morning. Criminal barristers are in dispute with the government over working conditions and government set fees for legal aid as a backlog of cases mounts ever higher. Well, last week, the Criminal Bar Association accused the government of refusing to negotiate, warning that victims of crime and defendants seeking to prove their innocence will not see their day in court if ministers do not take steps to re-inject funds into a barely functioning justice system. Well, the Ministry of Justice said criminal barristers will receive a 15% fee rise from the end of September, meaning they will earn around £7,000 more per year, a figure met with more anger by barristers. Heathrow Airport has apologised to passengers caught up in recent travel chaos, but warned that more flights could be cancelled. The UK's largest airport asked airlines to remove 61 flights from today's schedules as it sought to cope with soaring demand and staff shortages. Tens of thousands of passengers have been affected by travel disruption these last few weeks. Airports and airlines have struggled to recruit staff after shedding jobs during COVID lockdowns as holiday demand returns, with many blaming Brexit as we can no longer call on EU workers to fill those gaps. A woman has been stabbed in the back by a cyclist in the same area of East London where Zara Elena was killed. The stabbing victim, who is 27 years old, was hospitalised after the attack on St John's Road in Ilford. It happened at around 8 p.m. on Friday night. Police want to speak to a man on a green bike dressed in black. A man has been jailed after admitting murder following a brutal and sustained assault in Homerton. 25-year-old Jordan Graham pleaded guilty at the Old Bailey today to the murder of Abu Yusuf Twaha and was sentenced to a life imprisonment with a minimum of 15 years. Abu was killed while staying in a hostel in Wells Street in Hackney when a fight between him and Jordan Graham broke out. CCTV in the hall corridor showed Graham repeatedly stamping and kicking Abu in the head and chest, who appeared unresponsive and no threat to him. And former Formula One boss Bernie Ecclestone will be charged with fraud by false representation over an alleged failure to declare £400 million worth of overseas assets to the government. The charge against the 91-year-old London-based billionaire was authorised by the Crown Prosecution Service today following an investigation by Revenue and Customs. Simon York, who is Chief Investigation Officer from HMRC's fraud team, said that the investigation had been complex and worldwide. And on to the weather now. Londoners are being urged to check in on the vulnerable and elderly amid warnings that temperatures are set to be hotter in the UK than in Jamaica and the Maldives. Health warnings come as temperatures are forecast to reach 33 degrees C for today or at some point in the next few. Level 3 heat health alerts are in place across the south, the Midlands and eastern parts of England as well. The Met Office is advising people to stay indoors over lunch and drink plenty of fluids. To cope, parents are also being encouraged to limit their children's exposure to the sun. The heat health alerts are expected to stay in place until next weekend. On the weekend, it's looking like we could be hitting the mid-30s. A bit more context then. Around 18 degrees overnight this evening, so a warm sleep. Tomorrow, low 30s again, a dry and bright day throughout. Wednesday dipping to high 20s, but still feeling incredibly hot in the sun, similar as we head through the week. And as I say, climbing ever so slightly into those low 30s again by the weekend, mid-30s on Sunday. Right, well, let's just have a look at this before the break. An animal accustomed to finding shade in this heat in its natural habitats, but over here in the capital, an endangered lion, which has suffered from persistent earache, looks set to roar back into action following, yes, you guessed it, a CAT scan at London Zoo. 12-year-old Asiatic lion Banu has had frequent problems with his left ear canal and attempts to resolve the issue, including specialist ear examinations and cleaning after they failed. Well, hope is on the horizon. Let's take a look.
You could see his ear was uncomfortable. So a few times we've got hands-on, under anaesthetic, had a look at the ear, had some specialists come in, and we could see that we couldn't get very deep into that ear compared to the other ear. But even the other ear, they're such very big ears with no instruments designed to go in there that it was very difficult to appreciate what was going on and to really get to the bottom of it all, and also to check that he had no middle ear disease, which is an area you can't actually see. We needed to have a better look using a CAT scan. So we got a CAT scan for our big cat. And we did this by getting a truck with a CT scanner on board, so that we could safely move Banu just from his den into the CAT scan and back to his den, which was safe and comfortable for everybody, rather than moving him far away.
Well, there you go. Let's just hope that lion can sleep tonight. We're heading into a short break. Stay with us. An urgent appeal for 42,000 new Londoners to come forward and give blood. We'll hear about the new NHS initiative in conjunction with TfL.
From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live. From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live. From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live.
Welcome back to London Live News. Let's just take a look at some of the day's other main headlines affecting Londoners today. More than 1 in 10 students are using food banks because they cannot make ends meet during the cost of living crisis. That's according to a survey of more than 3,500 university students by the National Union of Students. They found that 96% were cutting back as a result of the crisis, with 1 in 5 unable to buy toiletries and 1 in 10 unable to buy sanitary products when needed, while a third were living on less than £50 a month after paying rent and bills. More than half of people are worried about facing dangerously long waits for ambulances and A&E treatment if they fall seriously ill. That's according to a new poll. A Press Association survey of more than 1,000 British adults found over 60% of people were not confident an ambulance would arrive quickly if they needed one. It comes amid reports of ambulances taking hours to arrive, patients waiting for hours in packed A&E departments, and the NHS struggling with widespread staffing gaps. And post office workers have launched a 24-hour strike over pay today, with more industrial action due later this week. Members of the Communication Workers Union are on strike at Crown post offices, the larger branches usually sited on high streets. Supply chain and administrative workers will strike on Thursday, which the union said will affect sub-post offices as well. Right, the NHS Blood and Transplant and TfL have come together to make a joint urgent appeal for 42,000 new Londoners to come forward and give blood. New figures show over 400 new blood donors per day are needed in the capital based on current trends in demand, with a particular need to recruit more Black African, Black Caribbean and younger donors. Well, Hebe spoke to Sasa Cromack, who is the Regional Donor Centre Manager for London.
As we all know, we always need blood stocks. It's really, really important because we want to continue saving lives within the NHS. So what NHS Blood and Transplant have been recently partnered with is Transport for London, and we're currently running what's called the London Donor Experience. So this is looking at where we are focusing on donors who travel through the central line through London to get more donors in to donate. So really interesting fact is that if just 6% of the people who go on the central line, commuters, gave blood last year, that would mean we would hit our target, which is currently we need 42,000 new donors to come in and donate. It's amazing, really, if you think about it. That's what we need at the moment to help our blood stock levels. This will really support donors, this will really support our patients, and bring in new people to help patients and save lives. So this is our new campaign, and that's what we're pushing for.
And why is there such a high number of donors needed in the capital?
Yeah, so we always need new donors because we have to replenish donors that unfortunately can't continue to donate for a very amount of reasons. So we always need new people to make up those people who can't do it anymore. And then we continue to need more donors, especially from sort of Black African and Black Caribbean ethnicities, to help treat people with specific blood disorders like sickle cell. And we know in London there's a high prevalence of people with those ethnicities, and so therefore we do push for more donors in the London area. And it's vital that we maintain and increase the amount of donors we have to be able to manage the amount of demand that we do have from hospitals, especially now sort of post-COVID. Hospitals are trying to get back to operating as much as they can, and therefore their need for blood has increased, and that's what we're trying to do, is match what they need and support them so they can get back to running as business as usual, and we can support those operations taking place.
Such a small number of Londoners actually need to come forward to make this difference. So what are you exactly doing with TfL? How are you going about making this appeal?
Yeah, so with the advertisement on there, people will see it. It'll be very easy for people to recognise our branding, get us in. On the central line itself, we have 3 blood donation centres. One at Stratford City, West End, which is at one end in the east of London. And then in central London, we have West End Donor Centre. And then on the other side, on West London, we also have Shepherd's Bush Donor Centre. So we're hoping, because it's the most amount of donor centres on one tube line. So we're trying to capture everyone who goes on it and get as many people in to donate and help save lives.
There you go. Well, you should head to the NHS website if you want more information on that one. Search for blood donation. Now, the Women's Euros is well underway, with host favourites England victorious in their first game of the tournament against Austria the other night. The match saw a record attendance for a Women's Euros match, with that stat expected to be broken again, with Wembley due to host other games, including the final, which the Lionesses could well be at. Well, this evening they're in action once again against Norway. London Live reporter Henry Thomas Aldridge talk us through tonight's game and the rest of the tournament.
Yes, England versus Norway is at the Amex Stadium in a couple of hours' time. Now, this is probably the toughest test for the Lionesses in the group stage. They played Austria last week and won 1-0, but Norway are a different level. And that's partly because of Ada Hegerberg. Now, she is a 6-time Champions League winner. She was the winner of the inaugural Ballon d'Or, and she's back in the national team for the first time for 5 years. And that's because of a protest against the perceived lack of respect that women's footballers got in the country. So she's back, and yeah, she's going to raise the level. But under Sarina Wiegman for England, she hasn't lost a game. So the Lionesses still haven't lost under their new manager, and so they're obvious favourites for this game. But it's certainly going to be a good topic contest between the two.
Yeah. First game of the tournament at Old Trafford, there was record attendance for a women's football game. It's quite something, and it's good to see. What does it say, perhaps, about this tournament and the way things are going for women's football?
Well, often the narrative around women's football is all about the growth of the game and how much it's improved for the last sort of 5-10 years, and the football chat can be forgotten. But I think last week was a real momentous occasion for women's football in this country. 70,000 people at Old Trafford, and a lot of people saying who've been to Lioness games for 5, 10, even longer, they're saying it was a really emotional evening. And the fact that now girls across the country can actually view themselves as potentially being footballers when they're older, when 5-10 years ago that wasn't ever the case, and there were barriers constantly to even watching their favourite team play. So it is a real momentous occasion, and this tournament is set to be one of the best women's football tournaments ever.
Yeah. Having said that, though, and it's something I picked up on when I was looking through the fixture list for the next few weeks, not many big stadiums are being used in this tournament, particularly when it comes to London. We have Chelsea's stadium, we have Arsenal stadium, we have West Ham's stadium, the London stadium, but none of them being used apart from Wembley when we get to the finals. Why aren't they using any of the big grounds apart from, as you say, Old Trafford in that first match?
Well, yeah, as you say, 70,000 in for Old Trafford last Wednesday, but that's the first time and only time that stadium will be used in the tournament. And there's a real, a sense of disappointment, the fact that even for maybe the England games, that they couldn't have some big stadiums to have these massive crowds and get as many people in as possible. But the reason is because these stadiums, these cities around the country actually have to want and apply to be part of the tournament, and apparently, according to the FA, not enough did that. But I think there was an Icelandic player who had to play at the Manchester City Academy Stadium for Iceland versus Belgium. They were saying it's really disrespectful that only 5,000 fans are going in, and that's less than a kilometre away from the Etihad Stadium with 55,000 capacity. And there's a real sense of, it's just right there, but we're not playing in that stadium. And a certain betting company actually inflated a blimp in the corner of the ground pointing to the Etihad Stadium. But there's a real sense of disappointment, but it is a chance for these cities around the country, like Rotherham, for example, that would never usually get international football. And it's a chance for them, for the youngsters around there, to get to see some of their favourite players. But on the positive side, 500,000 tickets have been sold for this tournament, which is more than double for the 2017 Euros. So there is a sense of, there are positives as well to go with this.
Yeah, And obviously the small London stadium, apart from Wembley being used as the Brentford Community Stadium, I believe that's the main other London stadium in action. Just quickly, Henry, before we leave you, a couple of names in the England team to look out for tonight, particularly some of those London stars.
Yes, well, Lauren Hemp actually is seen as another Messi, the women's version of Messi. She is playing for England this evening. She's actually been voted as the PFA Young Player of the Year award 4 times, and that's a record. So she could be a household name by the end of the summer. Fran Kirby is always one to watch. She plays for Chelsea. So there's a host of names in this England team. But I wanted to touch on some others as well. Ada Hegerberg, I already mentioned for Norway. She's off the back of a Champions League win. And she's tipped by some to lead Norway as dark horses through the tournament. And then Vivian Miedema, who's Arsenal striker, Netherlands striker as well. So we've seen her in London, obviously playing for Arsenal, but for the Netherlands, playing against England potentially later in the tournament is certainly one to watch. But later on, England versus Norway is certainly set to be a spectacle. As I said earlier, one of the toughest games for England.
There you go, tonight at 8 o'clock, England-Norway. You're watching London Live News with James Dickman. A reminder of our top stories coming up after the break, plus a new book calling on men to do more in the fight to end violence against women after Zara Elena became the latest victim of male violence on the capital streets.
From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live. From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live. From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live.
Welcome back to London Live News. Just to have a recap of some of our top stories we've been running today, starting with Uber, who secretly lobbied ministers to influence London's transport policy, apparently. It's been reported today that leaked documents show lobbyists for the ride-sharing app company met then Chancellor George Osborne and other ministers in July 2014. According to the BBC, well, the undeclared meetings took place after Boris Johnson, as Mayor of London, had promised to launch a review that could have limited Uber's expansion in the capital. The meeting with Mr. Osborne took place at a private dinner in the US state of California, where Uber is based. The politicians, which also includes Sajid Javid, who's running to be the next leader of the Tory party, say that lobbying rules were followed and that all business meetings were declared. Boris Johnson has said he will not endorse any candidate in the leadership race to become the next Conservative Party leader. He is determined to deliver the mandate, however, he says. He was elected on in 2019 in his final few weeks as Prime Minister. Here's what he said today.
I'm doing the last few days, weeks, or however long it is, but the job of government has got to be carried on in that period. I've set out for people what the Tory, the parliamentary party have decided. That has the inevitable consequences that it has. But my job, just in the next few days and weeks, is to continue with the programme on which we were elected.
Well, Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is the latest big name to enter the leadership race, pledging to start cutting taxes from day one. Bob Blackman, Joint Executive Secretary of the Tories' 1922 committee, says it's likely candidates will need the support of 36 MPs to progress from the first round. So far, 11 candidates are in the running, which sees other big names such as Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt, Grant Shapps, Nadhim Zahawi all stepping up. The unifying One Nation Tory backbencher Tom Tugendhat looks to be a dark horse in the runoff, though former Chancellor Rishi Sunak remains the bookies' favourite. Priti Patel is also weighing up a bid, so we could enter this race with 12 candidates. Well, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said candidates are engaged in an arms race of fantasy economics.
Well, what we've seen this weekend from all the Tory candidates who want to be leader of their party is £200 billion of unfunded spending commitments. And my challenge to them is say precisely where that money is coming from. Is it going to be cuts? If so, what's going to be cut? Because we need to know. Is it going to be borrowing? If so, where are you borrowing from? How much are you borrowing? Or is it just the magic money tree? The contrast between the circus at the top of the Tory party and the Labour Party couldn't be greater. We've set out costed funding commitments and explained exactly where the money is coming from.
Now, murdered on their way home at night. The tragic deaths of women on London's streets, with most recently that of law graduate Zara Elena, has sparked an important debate about male violence towards women. A debate that perhaps reached boiling point during lockdown when Sarah Everard was killed by a serving Metropolitan Police officer in Clapham. Well, journalist and author Sophie Gallagher has penned a novel hoping to change the narrative away from an issue that women need to fix, but to one where men can help and become allies. How Men Can Help is a guide for men to show how they can realise they have the power to change what Sophie describes as an epidemic of violence against women and girls. Well, I spoke with her.
You know, it's the kind of book that a lot of women would pick up and say, yeah, I agree with all this. But ideally, you want men to pick it up and go, yeah, okay, this is what I should be doing. How do you get men to pick something like this up and read your book?
Well, I think that's the $1 million question, isn't it? When I was writing it, I was so aware of, you know, not wanting to, I guess, preach to the choir per se. Like, women know all this stuff. Perhaps we don't always have the words to articulate it, but we know all this stuff. It's how we live our lives. So you're right in that the only way this message really cuts through is if we can get men to pick it up too. And I guess the way that, you know, that I do think there are many men out there, lots of men who want to do more, who, you know, after things like Sarah Everard and stuff like that, has struck by the women around them, how they feel unsafe. You know, almost all men have some women in their life that they love or care about, and to think that they might be able to do something. I think often though, I guess similar to a lot of the anti-racism work that lots of people did in the last few years, people can feel like they want to do something but don't really know where to start. And so I think this book is sort of offering you, okay, you want to do something, well here's where to go next, really.
Yeah. After high profile incidents like, for example, you mentioned there Sarah Everard, most recently Zara Elena and Sabina Nessa last year, how frustrating is it when you see the backlash from women, which is great, and you see all the protesting from Reclaim These Streets and people like that, but when you see hashtags like not all men, how frustrating is that in terms of missing the point? It's a bit like Black Lives Matter one where people say, well, all lives matter. It's like, yeah, no one's not saying that, you missed it, it's gone over your head.
I think there's two strands of that. I think there's one strand of people who use that not all men in a really disingenuous way. They know that that's not the argument that's being made, but they don't want to have that conversation, to be introspective, because doing this work properly is a huge change, like a societal change, to recognise that actually women in many ways are still treated as second-class citizens, and that, you know, the harms that women face just when they're going about their daily lives. To change all that requires a lot of upheaval and changing things that maybe we take for granted. So I think there's one camp of people who, it's in really bad faith they make that argument, not all men. It's this kind of straw man argument. They know that's not what people are really arguing, but it's a convenient sort of distraction, right? Those people, fine, we're not going to engage those people because they've got their reasons. But then I think there's a much larger group of people who say that because they feel sort of attacked, and they don't really think that they deserve to be attacked, and they just need to sort of have someone kind of hold their hand and say, actually, that's not what's going on here, and be educated a bit more. And I think I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful that there are a lot of people in that camp as well who maybe defer to that out of sort of semi-defensiveness, but actually if you reach out, hold an olive branch out, there are lots of people who think, oh, actually, no, I can be part of this, they're not attacking me. A lot of this, actually, that when I was researching the book, I found how much this would improve men's lives, actually, if we confronted a lot of the things that are really harmful here. So I think, maybe over the past decade, there's been lots of talk about toxic masculinity. And I don't really like that phrase, because I think lots of men hear it and they think, you're saying men are toxic. And that's not what it means. But if that's what lots of people hear, well, then it's not useful, is it? Because that immediately makes people say, no, I'm shutting down, I don't want to listen. But the argument that is being made about that is it is something that men should listen to. There are lots of parts of how men are expected to behave that are really difficult. They're really limiting on men being breadwinners, being strong, being tough. All those things that men feel like they have to be in order to be a proper man are incredibly limiting on men as well, and really dangerous for women who experience the fallout of that angry masculinity. And so, in some ways we could say, men, we can get you on side by appealing to, your wife, your daughter, your mother, your sister. But in other ways, in more long-term ways, I think men should see the benefits in us all doing this work. If we reduced, the power of patriarchy and the harmful things that men have to do or feel they have to do as well, that would be better for men. If men could feel like they could spend more time with their children, or feel like they could speak more openly about their feelings, or feel like they were able to express feelings other than just anger, and that wouldn't lessen their status as a man, all of those things surely would be better for men as well.
There you go, How Men Can Help, a guide to allyship, accountability and improving the future by Sophie Gallagher is out now. Right, stay with us. We're taking a little break now, but still to come. Comedian, writer and director Andy Hamilton will be in the studio to talk about his hilarious and honest new stand-up show, reflecting on his life in comedy for the last 40 years. Stay with us, you won't want to miss that one.
From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live. From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live. From breaking news to headline events, the latest trends and places to be.
You can now keep up to date on daily life in London across London Live's social platforms.
Start the day with an update on the travel and weather, and know what's on around the city and what's being seen by others.
With stories from London Live's team of reporters and your videos of the news moments that matter.
Minute by minute. That's London Live News on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and more.
Find us at London Live.
Welcome back to the final part of this evening's programme. Now, to end this evening, a special interview with the humorist Andy Hamilton, perhaps best known for his appearances on Have I Got News for You and for his award-winning writing on sitcoms like Outnumbered. Well, in an evening of comic reflection, Andy will look back over his 40 years in comedy and nearly 70 years on the planet, and he tries to answer some questions in his new stand-up. Well, Helena spoke with Andy.
A tiny bit, it's exciting. The first time I did it, it was actually slightly moving. You know, I felt quite emotional walking out the first time because, you know, at the height of the pandemic, like a lot of people, you know, I wondered whether I'd ever get to do certain things again, and I did wonder whether appearing live in front of audiences was going to be a thing of the past. But no, I'm back out there doing it, and the audiences are really, I think, nationwide. The audiences that are coming out are really happy to be out, and they're really in quite a festive sort of mood, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as we know, the pandemic had an effect on everybody.
Yeah.
But for people like yourself and artists and comedians and people who thrive off that live audience, it had a very specific effect, I think. What was that time like for you?
Well, I was very lucky. I mean, if I'm honest, I'd be right down the bottom of the list of people who were seriously affected by the COVID pandemic, because my real job is writing. You know, that's in the days when you had to put your occupation on your passport, that's what it said, writer. And I go out and perform. That's always been a bonus for me. So I still had something to do, you know, because I could always write. So it was less of a challenge for me, but I did miss it, because I do like connecting with live audiences. So I'm thrilled to be back doing it. But yeah, so my lockdown was not too bad. My lockdown was pretty lockdown light, if I'm honest, you know.
Yeah. Well, in the show, you look back over your 40 years in comedy. How do you digest that into one show?
Well, you can't. I mean, to be honest, the show's much wider than that. I mean, that's something I you know, I can reflect on. I talk about, I tell a lot of jokes, and sometimes I look at the jokes and sort of talk about what the joke, you know, what the joke signifies, why jokes are important in life, why comedy is important in life. But the show is pretty free. At the interval, I leave a bucket at the front of the stage, and the audience fill it with written questions. So the second half, we can talk about absolutely anything, ranging from the small and the domestic to the sort of global and political. So it's a pretty free-ranging show.
So there's no limit on the questions that the audience can ask you?
No.
Have you had any particularly weird questions?
No, I don't. Well, I don't like algebra questions. I don't want any of those. Yeah, over the years, I've had loads of weird questions. I think one of the strangest was, I forget which venue it was now, but the question was, what's my middle name? So I managed to identify the member of the audience who'd put it in the bucket, and we started a guessing game, you know, and so I go, Gerald, no. Philip, no. Anton, no. And then I widened it to include the audience. So for about 10 minutes, we played this guessing game, a bit like the story of Rumpelstiltskin. You know, we were just all firing names at him. It was a lot funnier than it sounds, because it doesn't sound that funny. But as an experience, yeah, we got the whole audience participating in this guessing game. So that was maybe that was one of the most weird questions, but there's always the odd weird one, yeah.
As you mentioned there, you know, you get those silly and those weird questions, but you've also mentioned, you know, global and political questions and a scale of your comedy. I guess you've always kind of fused that political with comedy, but has that changed at all for you over the last few years?
Yeah, I've always written and done jokes about the politics of the day, and there's been a lot of that the last couple of weeks. No, it hasn't changed. I mean, I still find politics funny and absurd, so I still want to write jokes about it, and I'm quite opinionated, so, you know, I've usually got an angle on something. So no, it hasn't significantly changed. I mean, politics has changed. You know, politics has got a bit madder in the last sort of 10 years. But no, my urge to keep writing funny stuff about it hasn't changed, no.
Absolutely. Well, you've written on some of the UK's most famous comedy shows. Has that process changed for you at all?
Again, probably not. I mean, the essence of writing is always the same, which is, you know, how do you tell a story? How do you create engaging characters that people want to spend time with? You know, those essentials never really change. I mean, the process of getting stuff made, you know, getting stuff on telly or on radio or getting books published or whatever, that process goes through various changes, but it's still fundamentally the same process, which is you have an idea or you write something and then you try and convince somebody to put up the money to make it. That is always, you take it to market and you kind of keep your fingers crossed and hope that you find somebody gullible enough with enough money to do it, you know, or you hope that it just lands on their desk exactly at the right moment, you know. There's a lot of luck involved. So the essential process hasn't changed now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, your tour will end here in the capital at the Churchill Theatre. Have you performed there before?
The Churchill Theatre in Bromley, I think I have performed there before. I only say that because I've been touring, you know, off and on for about 15 years, I think. And I am getting to say quite a few times that I walk into a theatre and I think, I have been here before, and I can't always remember, but I have played at the Churchill Theatre Bromley before, yeah, many years ago.
You know, we talked about, like, if odd questions come up, but I wonder, because of this improvised nature of your show, are there questions that always crop up?
They do. I mean, there's usually a question or two about Outnumbered, you know, the TV show that I co-wrote with my friend Guy Jenkin. There's usually a question or two about Drop the Dead Donkey, which I made in the 1990s. There are a few questions. I've got a novel out at the moment, which is unique in that it's been published in manuscript. It's been published in my handwriting, which is genuinely unique, we think. I mean, we don't think a work of fiction has been published in manuscript since, you know, since William Caxton put all those monks out of work with the printing press, you know. So you get questions about projects, then you get those questions come up, and then like, who's the funniest person you've worked with, or who's the most horrible person you've worked with? You get those kind of questions.
Who's the most horrible person you've worked with?
Well, that flummoxes me. I got that the other night. And I couldn't possibly say on air, but they're a long time gone, and they weren't British. They were from Hollywood. So if they want to find out, they'll have to come to the show.
So a book published in a manuscript that you hadn't written.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit more about that. That is quite unique.
Yeah, well, it is unique. It's called Longhand, and it is it's something I've been thinking about doing for decades, but I had to have the right idea for it to work. So the idea is it's a letter that's been left by a very mysterious man explaining to his wife of 20 years why he's had to suddenly abandon her. So yeah, and it's in my handwriting, and yes, the handwriting is legible. And I'm very proud of it. Yeah, yeah, it's out there in all good bookshops, or if it's not, ask them to order it.
There you go. Andy is on tour, but is in London on Saturday, the 23rd of this month at the Churchill Theatre in Bromley. Just a final check on the weather for you now. Not a lot is changing apart from it being very, very, very hot. In the capital, it's going to get hotter as well over the next few days, as we're expecting a heat wave. There are warnings in place about that. It's a clear night this evening with overnight lows of around 18, so a sticky night to come. Tomorrow we'll move into the low 30s once again. More of the same throughout the week, but it is slowly climbing. Potentially record-breaking temperatures on the weekend. Make sure to have a bottle of water in hand and plenty of sunscreen if you're travelling, particularly on the Underground network. Right, that is all we got time for this evening. Thank you for watching. Do join us again tomorrow at the very same time. Plenty more on our social media channels, though. Follow us at London Live. But for now, good evening and take care.